Nothing hurts more than watching your own family lose faith in you. When 52-year-old Eli Mercer lost his job and inherited what looked like a pile of rusted metal and weeds, even his children rolled their eyes at Dad's big inheritance. The abandoned train station in Oregon hadn't seen a train in 50 years. His family called it worthless junk, but Eli felt something different when he walked those overgrown tracks. As he started cleaning up the mess, he found old logbooks with strange entries and a rusty conductor's key with weird markings. Local folks whispered stories about a ghost train that disappeared during the Cold War with valuable cargo that was never found. What Eli discovered beneath those forgotten tracks turned his worthless inheritance into a $300 million find. His family's laughter stopped real quick. But now powerful people wanted what he'd found, and this quiet dad had to fight to keep it. Could a man who'd lost everything find the strength to protect the discovery that could change his family's life forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a postal worker who seemed apologetic about the official-looking envelope that would change everything. Eli Mercer sat at his kitchen table, still in yesterday's clothes, staring at the formal document that bore the seal of Morrison and Associates, estate attorneys. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he kept holding the mug anyway, needing something solid in his hands. Property deed and inheritance notice. The letter began in that sterile legal language that made important things sound distant and unreal. Upon the death of Harold James Mercer, you are hereby designated as sole inheritor of the Cascade Falls Railroad Station and surrounding 4.2 acres located at mile marker 847, Canyon Road, Cascade Falls, Oregon. Eli had to read it 3 times before the words made sense. Great Uncle Harold was dead. The old man who'd sent Christmas cards with $5 bills tucked inside, who'd lived alone in the mountains for as long as anyone could remember, had left him something. Not just something, a train station. An actual honest-to-goodness train station. He'd been out of work for 6 months now. Pacific Northwest Manufacturing had closed its doors after 43 years, taking Eli's job in quality control with it. At 52, he was too old for most companies and too young to give up, caught in that terrible middle ground where experience meant expensive and reliable meant expendable. His unemployment benefits had run out last month. The house payments were 3 weeks behind. Sarah had moved out 2 years ago, taking half of everything and most of his confidence with her. She'd kept the kids Monday through Friday, leaving him with weekends that felt like borrowed time. Emma, 16 and sharp-tongued like her mother, barely looked up from her phone when she visited. Jake, 14, and still willing to throw a baseball in the backyard, was the one bright spot in Eli's shrinking world. "Dad, you're staring at that paper like it's going to catch fire," Jake had said the morning the letter came, grabbing a bowl of cereal before school. His sandy hair stuck up in 3 directions, despite Eli's attempts at parenting through hair gel and good intentions. "Your great-uncle Harold died," Eli had said, still processing the news himself. "He left me a train station." Jake paused mid-chew. "Like a real train station with trains?" "I don't think there are any trains, buddy. It's been closed for 50 years, so it's just a building?" "I guess so. I haven't seen it yet." That had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of phone calls to lawyers who spoke in acronyms and property assessors who used words like derelict and liability. 3 weeks of Sarah's voice on the phone, sharp with the kind of practical frustration that had defined the end of their marriage. "Eli, you need to be realistic about this," she'd said during their last conversation. "You can't afford to keep a worthless building. Sell it, take whatever you can get, and use the money to get back on your feet. The kids need stability, not some fantasy project." But something about the inheritance pulled at him in ways he couldn't explain to Sarah or the kids, or even himself. Maybe it was the memory of great-uncle Harold at family gatherings, sitting quietly in the corner with his worn hands and patient eyes, listening to everyone else's stories without sharing his own. Maybe it was the simple fact that someone had thought enough of Eli to leave him something, anything, when the rest of the world seemed to have written him off. The drive to Cascade Falls took 2 hours through winding mountain roads that carved through Douglas fir forests and crossed streams still swollen with spring snowmelt. Eli had made the trip alone on a Saturday morning, leaving Jake at Sarah's house, where he belonged during the week now. The radio played old country songs that seemed to match the rhythm of his thoughts. Slow, contemplative, touched with the kind of melancholy that came from looking backward too often. Cascade Falls had been a logging town once, back when the railroad brought prosperity and the promise of permanence. Now, it was one of those places that existed in the spaces between more important destinations, sustained by a handful of local businesses and the stubborn loyalty of families who'd been there for generations. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with buildings that had seen better decades. A few had been converted into antique shops and cafes that catered to weekend visitors from Portland, but most stood empty, their windows papered with old newspapers and faded for-rent signs. Martha's Diner sat at the corner of Main and Cedar, its neon sign flickering with the persistence of something that refused to give up. Eli pulled into the gravel parking lot and sat in his truck for a moment, gathering the nerve to ask directions to a place he'd inherited but had never seen. Through the diner's windows, he could see locals hunched over coffee and conversation, the kind of scene that played out in small towns across America every morning. Familiar faces, sharing familiar complaints about weather and politics, and the kids who'd moved away to find better opportunities. The bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful ding that seemed optimistic compared to his mood. The conversations paused just long enough for everyone to size up the stranger before resuming in slightly lower voices. Eli chose a stool at the counter and ordered coffee from a woman whose grey hair was pulled back in a practical bun and whose smile carried the professional warmth of someone who'd been serving coffee to strangers for decades. "You're not from around here," she said, and it wasn't a question. "No, ma'am, I'm looking for the old train station, the Cascade Falls Railroad Station." Her expression shifted, curiosity replacing routine pleasantries. "You'd be Harold Mercer's nephew, then, the one who inherited the place." Word traveled fast. "In small towns," Eli nodded. "Great-nephew, actually. I'm Eli Mercer." "Martha Kowalski," she said, extending a hand that was firm and calloused. "Harold was a good man. Quiet, but good. Came in here every Tuesday for 20 years, ordered the same thing every time. Coffee black, 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast. Never missed a Tuesday until he took sick last month." "I wish I'd known him better," Eli said, and meant it. "He talked about you sometimes. Said you worked with your hands, that you understood the value of things built to last." Martha refilled his coffee without being asked. "The station's about 5 miles out Canyon Road. You'll see the sign, though it's mostly covered in blackberry vines now. Road gets rough the last half-mile. Hasn't been maintained since the railroad pulled out." "Is it worth anything? The property, I mean." Martha considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "Depends on what you mean by worth," Harold paid. "The taxes on it for 50 years, never missed a payment. Always said it was important to keep it in the family, though I never understood why until now." "What do you mean, until now?" "Well, you're here, aren't you? First family member to visit since Harold's funeral. Maybe he knew something we didn't." The drive to the station took Eli deeper into the mountains, past abandoned logging roads and clear cuts that were slowly healing with alder and Douglas fir saplings. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to something that was more suggestion than road, winding through a canyon where the walls rose steep and green on both sides. He almost missed the sign, a weathered piece of wood that read Cascade Falls RR Station in faded letters barely visible through the tangle of blackberry vines that had claimed it. The road curved sharply to the right, and suddenly, there it was the Cascade Falls Railroad Station, sat in a natural clearing where the canyon opened into a pocket valley. It was smaller than Eli had imagined, but somehow more substantial. Built from local stone and heavy timber in the style of railroad stations from the early 1900s. The roof sagged in places, and ivy had climbed the walls with the patient determination of decades, but the bones of the building were solid. Good bones, his grandfather would have said. The platform stretched along the front of the building, its wooden planks weathered silver grey but still intact. To the right, a water tower leaned, at an angle that suggested it had been abandoned to gravity and time. Rails emerged from the forest on both sides of the station, disappearing into tunnels of blackberry vines and maple saplings that had reclaimed the right-of-way. But the steel was still there, still solid under the overgrowth, still pointing toward destinations that had mattered once upon a time. Eli parked his truck and stepped onto the platform. The silence was profound, not empty, but full of something he couldn't name. The wind moved through the trees with a sound like distant water, and somewhere a woodpecker hammered against deadwood with mechanical persistence. The air smelled of moss and cedar and the green smell of things growing wild. He found the key where the lawyer had said it would be, hidden under a loose stone in the foundation. The lock on the station door was old, but well-maintained, opening. With a satisfying click that echoed across the platform, the door swung inward on hinges that protested with the voice of dry metal, and Eli stepped into his inheritance. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that slanted through windows, clouded with 50 years of weather. The waiting room was small but well-proportioned, with wooden benches along the walls and a ticket window that looked out onto the platform. Behind the window, he could see into the stationmaster's office, where papers still lay scattered across a desk, as if someone had stepped out for lunch and never returned. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but underneath, the details were remarkable. The floor was made of solid oak planks, scarred but unwarped. The wainscoting had been crafted by someone who understood wood and took pride in the work. Even the light fixtures, hanging from chains that had gone green with age, were built with the kind of attention to quality that had disappeared from the world along with the trains. Eli walked through the station slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. A door at the back led to a small apartment, 2 rooms and a kitchenette that had been the station master's quarters. The furniture was still there, covered in sheets that had once been white but had yellowed with time. Through the back window, he could see a small garden plot where volunteer fruit trees had grown wild and productive, their branches heavy with apples that no one had harvested. He spent the rest of the afternoon walking the property, following the train tracks into the forest until they disappeared under fallen logs and accumulated leaves. The right-of-way was surprisingly wide, carved through the mountainside with the ambition of an age that believed in progress and the permanent value of connection. Every few hundred yards, he found mile markers still standing, their numbers faded but readable. As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, painting the station in shades of gold and amber, Eli sat on the platform and tried to imagine what his great-uncle had seen in this place. It wasn't valuable in any conventional sense, too remote for development, too old for modern use, too expensive to maintain. But there was something here that went deeper than market value or practical utility. Maybe it was the peace. For the first time in months, Eli felt the knot of anxiety in his chest begin to loosen. No phone calls from bill collectors, no job interviews that ended with polite rejections, no conversations with Sarah about his failures as a provider and father, just the sound of wind in the trees and the solid presence of something built to last. When he finally locked the station door and walked back to his truck, Eli already knew he wouldn't be selling. Not yet. Not until he understood what Harold had seen in this place, what had been worth 50 years of tax payments and solitary guardianship. The drive back to Portland took him through darkness, punctuated by the occasional lights of small towns. and logging camps. The radio played the same country songs, but now they seemed less melancholy, more like conversations with old friends. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Eli had made a decision that would have worried Sarah, and probably should have worried him. He was going to restore the station. Eli returned to the station the following Saturday with a truckload of cleaning supplies and a thermos of coffee that would have to substitute for Martha's diner hospitality. The morning mist clung to the canyon walls like smoke, and the air carried the sharp bite of early spring in the mountains. He'd told Jake about his decision to clean up the place, carefully avoiding the word restore that would have prompted questions he wasn't ready to answer. "Can I come next time?" Jake had asked, looking up from his homework with the kind of interest he usually reserved for baseball stats and video games. "It's just cleaning right now, buddy. Lot of dust and dirt. Pretty boring stuff." But as Eli unlocked the station door and stepped into the morning light that streamed through the grimy windows, he realized there was nothing boring about what he was uncovering. Each surface he cleaned revealed details that spoke of craftsmanship and care: hand-carved molding around the ticket window, inlaid wood patterns in the floor, brass fixtures that gleamed like gold once the tarnish was polished away. He started in the station master's office, carefully sorting through the papers that had been left scattered across the desk. Most were routine railroad documents, supply orders, maintenance schedules, correspondence about freight rates, and passenger manifests from the early 1950s. But underneath a stack of yellowed invoices, he found something that made him pause. Leather-bound logbook, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling, lay open to an entry dated September 15th, 1952. The handwriting was careful and precise, the kind of penmanship they'd taught in schools when permanence mattered more than speed. "Special transport arrived 0347 hours, the entry read. "Manifest sealed. Passengers disembarked for 40-minute rest. Engineer reported mechanical difficulties with brake system. Delay expected. Contacted dispatch. Awaiting further instructions." Eli flipped through the pages, finding similar entries scattered throughout the fall of 1952 and into the spring of 1953. Special transports that arrived at odd hours. Passengers who weren't identified by name. Manifests that were sealed rather than recorded. The final entry was dated March 17, 1953. Special Transport 847 arrived, 02 waiting hours. Manifest sealed as ordered. Passengers remained aboard. Engineer reported receiving new routing instructions via telegraph. Train departed 02:45 hours eastbound. Station master note: no departure scheduled on manifest. Contacted dispatch, no response. Telegraph lines down due to storm. After that, nothing. The logbook continued with routine entries about regular passenger and freight trains through the summer of 1953, then stopped abruptly in October when the last scheduled service ended and the Cascade Falls station was officially closed. Eli sat back in the station master's chair, feeling the weight of decades settling around him like dust. The logical part of his mind suggested a simple explanation. Wartime transportation often involved secrecy, and the early 1950s had been filled with the anxious logistics of the Cold War. Military personnel and equipment moved on schedules that civilian railroad workers wouldn't have understood or questioned, but something about the entries bothered him. The careful notation of sealed manifests, the odd arrival times, the final mysterious departure that seemed to have surprised even the station master. And why had Harold kept these logbooks when everything else from the railroad era had been cleared away? He spent the rest of the morning cleaning windows and sweeping floors, but his thoughts kept returning to the logbook and its cryptic references to Special Transport 847. By afternoon, the station was beginning to reveal its original character: warm wood tones and clean lines that spoke of an era when public buildings were designed to inspire confidence in progress and permanence. The transformation was remarkable enough that, when Martha arrived at closing time with a covered plate and a thermos of coffee, she stopped in the doorway and whistled low. "Harold would be proud," she said, setting the plate on the clean ticket counter. "Meatloaf and mashed potatoes." Figured, "You'd worked up an appetite." "You didn't have to do that." "Course I did. Can't have you wasting away out here. Besides, I wanted to see what you'd accomplished." She looked around the waiting room with approval. "Takes me back to when I was a girl. My grandmother used to take the train to Portland every Christmas to visit her sister. I'd come with her sometimes. Felt like the most sophisticated thing in the world, buying a ticket and sitting on these benches waiting for the train." They sat on the platform sharing the meal as the sun slanted low through the canyon. Martha told stories about the station's heyday, when 3 passenger trains a day connected Cascade Falls to Portland and points east, when the platform bustled with travelers and the telegraph office stayed busy with messages from around the region. "Did you ever hear anything about special trains?" Eli asked, trying to keep the question casual. "Military transports or government trains during the war?" Martha chewed thoughtfully, her eyes narrowing with the effort of memory. "There were stories. Folks would see lights down here at night sometimes, hear train whistles when there weren't supposed to be any scheduled runs. But you know how small towns are. People talk, especially during wartime, when everyone was jumpy about saboteurs and secret operations." "What kind of stories?" "Oh, the usual foolishness. Mysterious passengers, trains that came and went without appearing on any official schedule. Mrs. Chen, she runs the Historical Society now. Her father worked for the railroad back then. He used to claim he saw foreign diplomats and military officers on some of those night trains. Said they carried things that weren't on any manifest." "Mrs. Chen might remember more details?" "Could be. She's got a good memory and a filing cabinet. Full of local history. Lives in the White House with the blue shutters 2 blocks south of the diner. Tell her I sent you, and she'll talk your ear off about railroad law." After Martha left, Eli walked the platform in the gathering darkness, listening to the night sounds of the forest and thinking about trains that might have passed through 50 years ago, carrying passengers and cargo that weren't supposed to exist. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to make the rails gleam like silver threads, disappearing into the tunnel of vegetation that had reclaimed the right-of-way. He was about to head back to his truck when he noticed something that made him stop. About 50 yards from the station, where the eastbound tracks curved toward the canyon wall, there was a gap in the vegetation. Not random, like the other clearings, but deliberate, as if someone had been maintaining access to this particular section of the right-of-way. Curious, he grabbed a flashlight from his truck and followed the cleared path. The rails here were in better condition than elsewhere, still solidly anchored to their ties, still properly aligned. But more interesting was what he found beside the tracks, a concrete marker post, about 3 feet high, with numbers stenciled in faded paint. 847, the same number from the logbook's final entry. Special transport. 847. Eli knelt beside the marker, running his fingers over the worn concrete. It was substantial construction, built to last, like everything else from that era of American infrastructure. But why mark this particular spot? What made mile marker 847 significant enough to maintain when everything else had been allowed to go wild? The sound of gravel crunching under tires made him look up. Headlights swept across the station platform as a car pulled into the clearing, moving slowly, deliberately. Eli switched off his flashlight and stepped behind the marker post, suddenly aware of how isolated the station was, how far from help. The car stopped beside his truck, the engine shut off, and in the silence that followed, he could hear the tick of cooling metal and the distant hoot of an owl. A car door opened and closed with the solid thunk of expensive German engineering. "Mr. Mercer." The voice was cultured, professional, carrying the kind of authority that came from boardrooms and corner offices. "I know you're here. Your truck's still warm." Eli considered his options, none of them particularly appealing. He was trespassing on his own property, hiding behind a concrete post because a stranger had arrived after dark. The whole situation felt absurd, but something about the man's tone suggested this wasn't a casual visit. I'm Marcus Vale from Meridian Development Group, the voice continued. I've been trying to reach you about your property. We should talk. Eli stepped out from behind the marker, keeping the flashlight pointed down. Little late for a business call, isn't it? The man was silhouetted against his car's headlights, but Eli could make out an expensive suit and the kind of confident posture that came from never having to worry about the next mortgage payment. I was in the area on other business, saw your truck, and thought I'd take the opportunity for a face-to-face conversation. About what? About making you a very generous offer for this property, more generous than anything you're likely to see from local buyers. Vale gestured toward the station. You've been cleaning the place up. That's admirable, but ultimately pointless. The building has no practical value, the location is too remote for development, and the maintenance costs will eat you alive. Maybe I like the isolation. Mr. Mercer, let's be honest with each other. You're unemployed, behind on your mortgage, facing the reality that men your age aren't exactly in high demand in today's job market. This property is worth more to my clients than it could ever be to you, and we're prepared to offer enough money to solve your immediate problems and provide security for your children's future. The man's research was uncomfortably thorough. What clients? That's confidential, but I can tell you they're prepared to offer $200,000 for a clean, quick sale. Cash, no inspections, no contingencies. You could have a check in your hand by next Friday. It was more money than Eli had expected to see from the property, probably more than it was worth in any conventional sense. Enough to catch up on the mortgage, pay off the credit cards, maybe even start over somewhere without the weight of recent failures dragging him down. I'll need to think about it, of course, but don't think too long. My clients value discretion and efficiency. The longer this drags out, the more likely they are to look elsewhere. Vale reached into his jacket and produced a business card. Call me when you're ready to be practical about this situation. After the car's taillights disappeared, around the curve, Eli stood alone on the platform with the business card in one hand and the station's key in the other. $200,000 would solve a lot of problems, but it would also end whatever mystery had brought Great-Uncle Harold to this place every Tuesday for 20 years. He looked back toward mile marker 847, invisible now in the darkness, but somehow still present, still marking a spot that someone had thought important enough to maintain. Tomorrow he would visit Mrs. Chen and her filing cabinets full of local history. Tonight, he would add Marcus Vale's unexpected visit to the growing list of questions that needed answers. The drive home took him through sleeping towns and darkened valleys, but his mind was wide awake, turning over the pieces of a puzzle that seemed to grow more complex with each discovery. A mysterious train that had departed without authorization in 1953. A mile marker maintained long after the railroad had abandoned the line. A development company offering far more money than the property should be worth. And somewhere in the middle of it all, Great-Uncle Harold's patient vigil. 50 years of Tuesday morning coffee and quiet guardianship over secrets that had died with him. Eli was beginning to suspect that his inheritance was worth considerably more than anyone, including himself, had imagined. The question was whether he had the courage to find out exactly what Harold had been protecting all these years. Sunday morning found Eli back at the station with a different kind of purpose. The cleaning could wait. He needed answers more than he needed spotless windows. Armed with a crowbar and a growing sense that his great-uncle had left him more than just a building, he began a systematic search of the station's forgotten corners. Brass conductor's key revealed itself in the most obvious place, which was probably why he'd missed it during yesterday's cleaning. It hung on a hook behind the ticket window, tarnished green, but still solid, its ornate head bearing an insignia that didn't match any railroad logo he could remember. The design was intricate, intertwined letters that might have been CN or GN, surrounded by a wreath pattern that looked more military than civilian. He photographed the key with his phone, then slipped it into his pocket where it felt heavier than its size would suggest. The metal was warm against his fingers, as if it had been recently handled, though logic told him it had been hanging in that spot for decades. Mrs. Chen's house sat exactly where Martha had described it, a neat Cape Cod, with blue shutters and a garden that showed the patient attention of someone who understood that good things took time. She answered the door with flour on her apron and the bemused expression of someone whose Sunday morning routine had been pleasantly interrupted. "You're Harold's nephew," she said before he could introduce himself. "I can see the family resemblance. Around the eyes, come in, come in. I was just making dumplings for lunch. You'll stay and eat." It wasn't really a question, and Eli found himself seated at a kitchen table covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and manila folders that spilled decades of local history across the checkered tablecloth. Mrs. Chen moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to managing multiple tasks simultaneously, rolling dough while sorting through files and maintaining a steady stream of conversation that somehow never lost its thread. "Your great-uncle was a puzzle," she said, dusting flour from her hands before pulling out a thick folder labeled Railroad Era, 1947-1953. Came to every historical society meeting for 15 years, never said much, but always asked very specific questions about the station's final years, almost like he was looking for something particular. She spread out a collection of black and white photographs that captured the station during its active period. Passengers in suits and hats waiting on the platform, freight cars loaded with lumber and agricultural products, uniformed railroad workers posing beside gleaming locomotives. The images spoke of prosperity and connection, of a time when small towns like Cascade Falls mattered to the larger world. "Here's what your great-uncle always wanted to see," Mrs. Chen said, selecting a photograph that was notably different from the others. The station platform was empty except for 3 men in dark coats standing beside a passenger car that looked somehow official, more substantial than the regular coaches, with fewer windows and additional antennas that suggested communication. Equipment. When was this taken? March 1953, according to my father's notes. He was the station photographer for the local newspaper, took pictures of every train that came through, thinking someday it would be important historical documentation. Turned out he was right, just not in the way he expected. Eli studied the photograph more carefully. The 3 men weren't posing like typical travelers. Their stance suggested alertness, professional caution. Behind them, partially visible through the passenger car's window, he could make out additional figures and what looked like wooden crates stacked along the car's interior walls. "Did your father remember this particular train?" "He remembered it very well. Said it arrived around 2 in the morning, which was unusual. Most special trains came through during regular daylight hours when there was less chance of accidents. On the mountain grades." Mrs. Chen retrieved another folder, this one containing handwritten notes in Chinese characters with English translations penciled in the margins. "Father kept detailed records. Let me see what he wrote about that night." She ran her finger down the page, translating as she read. "Unscheduled arrival, March 17th, 1953. 3-car train, locomotive, passenger coach, and what he describes as a sealed freight car with military markings. Passengers remained aboard except for the 3 men who conducted some kind of inspection of the station facilities." Inspection of what? He doesn't specify, but he mentions that they spent considerable time examining the loading dock and the freight storage areas. They also asked detailed questions about the tunnel through canyon. Ridge, depth, construction, accessibility from both ends. Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What tunnel?" Mrs. Chen looked up from her father's notes with surprise. "The railroad tunnel, of course. How else do you think the trains got through the canyon? The tracks disappear into the mountainside. About half a mile east of your station, run through a quarter-mile tunnel, then emerge on the other side of the ridge." "I didn't know there was a tunnel." "Well, it's been sealed for 50 years. The railroad filled both ends with concrete when..." They abandoned the line, too expensive to maintain and too dangerous to leave open. But in 1953, it was the only way through that section of the mountains. She pulled out a detailed survey map of the railroad right-of-way, pointing to a dotted line that showed the tunnel's path through Canyon Ridge. Father always thought it was strange that those men were so interested in the tunnel specifications. Most railroad business involved schedules and freight manifests, practical concerns. But these men wanted to know about structural engineering, load-bearing capacity, things that didn't seem relevant to normal transportation. Eli showed her the photograph he'd taken of the conductor's key. Mrs. Chen studied the insignia through a magnifying glass, her expression growing more puzzled. "I've never seen this particular design," she said finally. "It's not from any of the major railroad companies that served this region. The craftsmanship suggests government or military manufacture. They were the only organizations that bothered with custom metalwork during that period. Could it be from that special train? Possibly. Father's notes mentioned that the train conductor carried what he described as unusual credentials. Not standard railroad identification, but something that satisfied the station master's questions about authority and routing. They spent the next hour going through Mrs. Chen's father's extensive documentation, building a picture of the Cascade Falls station's final months that was far more complex than the simple story of economic decline and abandonment that Eli had assumed. Multiple special trains had passed through during late 1952 and early 1953, all arriving at unusual hours, all carrying passengers and cargo that weren't recorded in standard manifests. Father believed these were government operations, Mrs. Chen explained. The early 1950s were a paranoid time. Nuclear weapons, communist infiltration, the Korean conflict. Military and intelligence agencies were moving personnel and equipment through civilian infrastructure to avoid attracting attention. But the final train, Special Transport 847, it never officially departed according to the station master's log. That's the mystery that fascinated your great-uncle. Father's records show the train arriving as scheduled, but there's no departure information. The next morning, the tracks were empty. The station was locked, and the telegraph lines had been damaged by what everyone assumed was storm weather. Eli thought about mile marker 847, maintained and accessible when everything else had been allowed to go wild. Mrs. Chen, in all your father's research, did he ever find any indication of what happened to that train? She was quiet for a long moment, studying the photograph of the three men on the platform. Father spent years trying to answer that question. He contacted railroad officials, government agencies, even wrote letters to the Pentagon. Everyone gave him the same response. No record of any special operations in this area during March 1953. They were lying, or the operations were classified at a level that made them invisible to normal record-keeping. Father eventually concluded that Special Transport 847 had been carrying something important enough to justify extraordinary secrecy, and that something had gone wrong during its passage through Cascade Falls. The dumplings were excellent, but Eli barely tasted them. His mind was racing through possibilities, each more intriguing and troubling than the last. A train that disappeared from official records, a tunnel sealed immediately after the railroad's abandonment, a mile marker maintained for 50 years by a great-uncle who'd never explained his obsession with the station, and now Marcus Vale's unexpected visit, offering money that seemed far too generous for a derelict building and 40 acres of overgrown forest. Mrs. Chen, did my great-uncle ever express any theories about what happened to that train? Harold was a careful man. He asked questions, but he kept his conclusions to himself. She paused, studying Eli with the same intensity she'd applied to her father's photographs. But I always suspected he knew more than he was willing to say, especially after he started paying the property taxes on the station year after year, long after it made any financial sense. He was protecting something. That was my impression. The question is what, and whether it's still worth protecting after all these years. Eli left Mrs. Chen's house with photocopies of her father's notes and a growing sense that his inheritance came with responsibilities he was only beginning to understand. The drive back to the station took him through afternoon shadows that seemed deeper, more complex than mere absence of sunlight. The conductor's key felt warm in his pocket, as if it were eager to fulfill its long-delayed purpose. Whatever lock it had been designed to open was still waiting somewhere in the forgotten corners of his great-uncle's legacy. Back at the station, he began a more systematic search of the building's hidden spaces. The ticket office yielded nothing beyond routine railroad forms and supply catalogues. The waiting room's wooden benches were solid, built without secret compartments or concealed storage. But the station master's office held possibilities that his earlier cleaning had missed. The desk was a substantial piece of furniture built from oak and brass in an era when business furniture was expected to last generations. Its drawers moved smoothly despite decades of neglect, revealing compartments filled with the detritus of daily railroad operations. Carbon paper, rubber stamps, forms in triplicate that documented the movement of people and goods through a world that no longer existed, but the bottom drawer stuck, resisting his attempts to open it with the persistence of something deliberately secured, rather than merely swollen with age. Eli worked at it patiently, using the techniques his father had taught him for dealing with stubborn mechanical problems. Eventually, the drawer yielded with a sharp crack, revealing not railroad paperwork, but something far more intriguing: a leather portfolio wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string that had survived 50 years in surprisingly good condition. Inside, he found maps of the railroad right-of-way that showed details missing from Mrs. Chen's historical documents: elevation changes, gradient calculations, and most importantly, detailed diagrams of the tunnel through Canyon Ridge. The tunnel was more complex than he'd imagined. The main bore ran straight through the mountain, but there were also side passages, equipment alcoves, and what the diagrams labeled as emergency storage areas carved into the living rock. Someone had annotated the margins with penciled notes that were barely legible after decades, but certain phrases stood out: structural capacity adequate, concealment possibilities excellent, access controllable. At the bottom of the portfolio, wrapped in a separate piece of oilcloth, was a second key, this one smaller than the conductor's key, made from the same brass but bearing a different insignia. Where the first key's design had been ornate and official, this one was simpler, more functional. A key designed to open something specific rather than to impress with authority. Eli held both keys up to the late afternoon light streaming through the office windows. They were a matched set, he realized, designed to work in sequence, one to gain access, the other to unlock whatever lay beyond. His great-uncle had left him not just a building, but a puzzle that had waited 50 years for someone with the patience and curiosity to solve it. The question was whether he had the courage to use them. The sealed government envelope waited behind, a false back in the desk's deepest drawer, hidden with the patience of secrets that had outlasted their keepers. Eli discovered it only because the portfolio's removal had revealed an inconsistency in the drawer's dimensions. The space should have been deeper, and persistence revealed why it wasn't. The envelope was heavy stock paper, cream-colored despite its age, bearing the eagle seal of the United States Department of State and a date stamp from March 16, 1953, one day before Special Transport 847's mysterious final journey. The wax seal had been broken and carefully resealed, suggesting Great-Uncle Harold had examined its contents but maintained their security through decades of guardianship. Eli's hands trembled slightly as he worked the old wax free. Inside were documents that transformed the station's mystery from local folklore into something with international implications. The first was a shipping manifest typed on official letterhead, but unlike any cargo list he'd ever seen, instead of describing commercial goods, it catalogued items in language that was deliberately vague, yet somehow ominous. Diplomatic materials, Eastern European origin, recovered status per Operation Paperclip protocols. Cultural artifacts, authentication pending, destination Smithsonian Institution pending, resolution of ownership disputes. Financial instruments, bearer bonds, Swiss Federal Bank verification required, but it was the final category that made Eli sit down heavily in the station master's chair. Strategic materials, classified per National Security Act, temporary, storage authorized pending Congressional Review Committee determination. The manifest was signed by officials whose titles meant nothing to him, but whose authority had clearly been substantial. Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, Assistant, Secretary of State for European Affairs, and someone identified only as Military Liaison, Project Safe Haven. A second document provided context that made the manifest's implications clear. It was a memorandum from the State Department to the CIA, dated March 15, 1953, detailing the movement of recovered assets from German and Austrian sources through secure transportation corridors to avoid public attention during ongoing congressional investigations into wartime recovery operations. The memo's language was careful, diplomatic, but its meaning was stark. Special Transport 847 had been carrying Nazi gold. Eli read the documents twice, then a third time, trying to process implications that seemed too large for the small office where he sat. The train that had disappeared into folklore had been part of a covert operation to move stolen wealth, recovered from Nazi Germany, gold, artwork, and financial instruments that represented the accumulated plunder of 6 years of systematic theft. But something had gone wrong. The final document in the envelope was a telegram dated March 18, 1953, one day after the train's disappearance. Transport 847 failed to arrive destination. No response radio contact. Weather severe Cascade region. Assume delay. Maintain operational security. Await status report. Safe Haven Command. There was no response to that telegram in the envelope. No indication that anyone had ever reported the train's ultimate fate. Special Transport 847 had simply vanished from the official record, leaving behind only the documents Harold had preserved and the questions that had haunted him for 50 years. Eli walked to the window and looked out at the overgrown tracks that disappeared into the tunnel of vegetation leading toward Canyon Ridge. Somewhere in that direction, if the documents were accurate, lay a fortune in recovered Nazi assets that had been intended for museums, banks, and government archives. Gold that should have been returned to its rightful owners, artwork that belonged in public collections, financial instruments that represented the stolen wealth of concentration camp victims and occupied nations. The moral complexity was staggering. If the treasure was still hidden somewhere along the route of Special Transport 847, who had the right to claim it? The federal government that had originally organized its transportation? The European nations from which it had been stolen, the families of Holocaust victims whose wealth it represented, or the man who had inherited the property where it might be concealed. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Kids want to visit this weekend. Can you handle both of them? Or should Emma stay with me?" The question brought him back to immediate realities. He was an unemployed single father sitting in an abandoned train station, contemplating documents that suggested his inheritance might be worth more than he'd ever imagined, while his ex-wife questioned his competence to manage a weekend with his own children. "Both fine," he texted back, looking forward to it. But even as he typed the response, part of his mind was calculating possibilities. If the documents were genuine, if Special Transport 847's cargo was still recoverable, the finder's fees alone would solve every financial problem he faced and provide security for Emma and Jake that extended far beyond weekend visits. The drive. Home took him past the turnoff to Canyon Ridge Road, where a rusted sign pointed toward recreational vehicle access, dead end. He'd driven that road once as a teenager, following it to its terminus at a Forest Service campground that had been closed for years. But now he wondered if the road's dead end was actually the eastern terminus of the railroad tunnel, the point, where Special Transport 847 might have emerged from its passage through the mountain if it had completed its journey. Instead of heading directly home, Eli turned onto Canyon Ridge Road and followed it through 5 miles of switchbacks and second growth. Forest. The pavement gave way to gravel, then to the kind of rough track that discouraged casual exploration. But he pressed on, guided by the kind of obsessive curiosity that had probably motivated Great Uncle Harold's decades of Tuesday morning visits to the station. The road ended exactly where his teenage memory suggested, at a small clearing that had once accommodated campers and picnickers, but at the far end of the clearing, barely visible through a screen of alder saplings, he could see the concrete barrier that sealed the eastern end of the railroad tunnel. The barrier was substantial, several tons of poured concrete reinforced with steel, designed to prevent access while withstanding the pressure of the mountain above. But 50 years of weather and seismic activity had created hairline cracks, and winter frost had widened some of those cracks into gaps large enough for a determined person to squeeze through. Not that he was considering such a thing. The tunnel would be dangerous after 5 decades of abandonment, potentially unstable, certainly home to bats and other wildlife that wouldn't appreciate human intrusion. But as he stood in the gathering dusk, looking at the sealed portal that might hold answers to questions that had consumed his great-uncle's life, Eli felt the pull of mysteries that demanded resolution. His phone rang, jarring him back to practical concerns. The caller ID showed Marcus Vale's name. "Mr. Mercer, I hope you've had time to consider our offer." "Still thinking about it. I understand this is a significant decision. Perhaps we could discuss it over dinner." "I'm staying at the Mountain View Lodge in Cascade Falls. Excellent restaurant, quiet atmosphere for business conversations." The invitation felt more like a summons, delivered with the kind of polished pressure that suggested Vale wasn't accustomed to extended negotiations. "I'm not ready to make any decisions yet, of course, but I should mention that my client's interest in the property is time-sensitive. They're prepared to increase the offer to $250,000, but only if we can conclude the transaction by the end of this week. $50,000 more for urgency that didn't make sense unless Vale's clients knew something about the property that they weren't sharing." "Why the rush?" "Market conditions, Mr. Mercer. My clients have identified several properties in the region that could meet their development needs. They'd prefer your location, but they can't wait indefinitely for a decision." After Vale hung up, Eli stood in the Forest Service clearing as full darkness settled over the mountains. The sealed tunnel entrance was invisible now, but he could feel its presence like a weight in the darkness, holding secrets that had already cost him sleep and peace of mind. The smart thing would be to take Vale's money and walk away. $250,000 would solve his immediate problems and provide a foundation for starting over somewhere without the complications of mysterious trains and government documents. He could move closer to the kids, find a job that didn't require him to confront the ghosts of covert operations and Nazi gold. But as he drove back toward the station to collect his truck, Eli knew he wouldn't be taking the easy path. Great Uncle Harold had spent 50 years protecting something, maintaining mile marker 847 and preserving documents that someone had thought important enough to steal, hide, and kill for. The least he could do was understand what Harold had died protecting. The station looked different in the darkness, more substantial somehow, as if the building's true nature only emerged when daylight couldn't diminish its shadows. He sat in his truck for a moment, engine running, heater fighting the mountain cold, and made a decision that would have worried Sarah, and probably should have worried him. Tomorrow he would bring Jake to the station, not just for cleaning and repairs, but because whatever lay hidden in Canyon Ridge Tunnel was part of his son's inheritance too, and because some secrets were too large for one person to carry alone, even if that person had Harold's patience and Harold's sense of duty. The conductor's key and its smaller companion were warm in his pocket, ready for locks they'd been designed to open. The government documents were secure in his jacket, evidence of operations that had been classified when his father was Jake's age. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the station platform, Special Transport 847's legacy waited for the family member who'd finally found the courage to claim it. Eli drove home, through sleeping towns and empty valleys, but his mind was fully awake, planning for discoveries that might change everything, or might lead to nothing more than 50-year-old disappointment. Either way, he was committed now to following the mystery, wherever it led, guided by the patient example of a great-uncle who'd understood that some responsibilities couldn't be abandoned, no matter how long they took to fulfill. The faded photograph arrived by certified mail on Thursday morning, delivered by a postal worker who seemed apologetic about requiring Eli's signature for what looked like routine correspondence. The envelope bore no return address, just a Portland postmark dated 2 days earlier, and his name written in the careful script of someone who understood that penmanship mattered. Inside was a black-and-white photograph, professional quality despite its age, showing the Cascade Falls station platform on what appeared to be a busy afternoon in early 1953. But this wasn't one of Mrs. Chen's father's documentary images. This photograph had been taken from a concealed position, capturing a scene that its subjects clearly hadn't intended to document. The image showed Special Transport 847 during what must have been its final stop. The locomotive was a massive steam engine, its brass fittings gleaming despite the photograph's age. Behind it, 2 passenger cars sat on the tracks with their windows darkened, but it was the third car that commanded attention. Unlike standard railroad freight cars, this one was heavily reinforced, with steel plates covering its sides and multiple padlocks securing doors that looked more like bank vault entrances than typical cargo access. But the real revelation was in the photograph's foreground. 3 men in expensive overcoats stood beside wooden crates that had been unloaded onto the platform, examining documents, while a 4th man, clearly military from his bearing and uniform, supervised the operation with the alertness of someone expecting trouble. Behind them, partially visible in the station's shadows, 2 additional figures watched the proceedings with the professional patience of men accustomed to waiting for orders. The photograph captured details that transformed speculation into evidence. The wooden crates bore stenciled markings that included Swiss banking symbols, museum inventory tags, and what appeared to be Nazi SS identification numbers. Some of the crates had been opened, revealing contents that glinted gold in the afternoon sunlight. A handwritten note was paperclipped to the photograph's back. Thought you should see what your great-uncle was protecting. Some secrets are worth keeping. Others need to find their way home. Choose wisely. No signature, no identification. Just the kind of cryptic advice that raised more questions than it answered. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Someone had been watching Eli's investigation, waiting for the right moment to provide evidence that confirmed his worst suspicions and greatest hopes. He called Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the retired government archivist, Mrs. Chen had mentioned, and reached her at home, where she spent her retirement organizing decades of classified materials that had finally been cleared for public review. "Mr. Mercer, I was wondering when you'd contact me. Your great-uncle and I corresponded for several years about Operation Safe Haven and its aftermath. You knew Harold. We never met in person, but he wrote thoughtful letters asking very specific questions about post-war recovery operations. I helped him access some declassified documents, though I always suspected he had access to information that I didn't." Eli described the photograph and its implications. Dr. Hendricks listened with the patience of someone accustomed to parsing the complexities of historical mysteries. Operation Safe Haven was one of the war's most successful and most problematic recovery efforts, she explained. By 1945, Allied forces had located billions of dollars in assets that the Nazis had stolen from occupied countries and concentration camp victims. Gold, artwork, financial instruments, jewelry, an entire economy built on systematic theft. And they were moving it through small railroad stations like Cascade Falls. The operation required discretion. Congressional investigations were ongoing. International lawyers were filing competing claims, and the media was asking uncomfortable questions about how much the government knew and when they knew it. Moving recovered assets through civilian infrastructure during off-peak hours minimized public attention. But Special Transport 847 never reached its destination. According to official records, there was no Special Transport 847, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist, just that someone made sure it disappeared from the paperwork. Dr. Hendricks paused, and he could hear papers rustling in the background. Mr. Mercer, if what you're suggesting is accurate, you may have inherited one of the war's greatest unsolved mysteries. What would happen if someone found the missing cargo today? Legally, it would be extraordinarily complicated. The original recovery operations were legitimate, but the cargo belongs to museums, governments, and individual families whose property was stolen. Finding it would trigger international legal battles that could last decades. And practically, finding it would make you wealthy, famous, and potentially very dangerous to certain people who have spent 70 years ensuring that particular cargo stayed lost. After the call, Eli sat in his kitchen staring at the photograph and thinking about danger that he'd never considered. Someone had taken this picture 50 years ago, preserved it through decades of secrecy, and delivered it to him at precisely the moment when its contents would have maximum impact. That suggested organization, resources, and planning that extended far beyond casual historical interest. His phone rang. Sarah's number. Eli, the kids are excited about this weekend. Emma's even packed hiking boots, which is a minor miracle. What exactly are you planning to do with them? Just some cleaning at the station, maybe a picnic if the weather's good. The station? You're still obsessing over that place? He could hear the familiar edge in her voice, the tone that had characterized the final months of their marriage, when every conversation became a negotiation about priorities and practical concerns. It's not an obsession, it's my inheritance. It's a distraction from real life. Marcus Vale called me, Eli. He said you've been avoiding his calls about selling the property. The news hit him like cold water. Vale called you? He's concerned that you're not thinking clearly about this opportunity. $250,000 would solve your problems and give you a fresh start. But you have to be realistic about the timeline. Sarah, you had no right to discuss my business with a stranger. He's not a stranger. He's offering you more money than you've ever seen, and you're too stubborn to recognize it. The kids need stability, Eli. They need a father who makes practical decisions, not someone who chases fantasies about old buildings. After she hung up, Eli sat in the silence of his empty house and tried to process the implications of Vale's contact with his ex-wife. It suggested a level of pressure and investigation that went far beyond normal business practices. Vale wasn't just interested in buying the property, he was orchestrating circumstances to force a sale. But why? What made the station valuable? Enough to justify harassment and manipulation, unless Vale's clients knew exactly what Special Transport 847 had been carrying and where it might be hidden. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. If he was right, if the missing cargo was still concealed somewhere along the railroad's route through Canyon Ridge, then he wasn't just the inheritor of the abandoned building. He was the custodian of treasures that belonged to museums and families around the world. wealth that could fund his children's education and secure their futures, and secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. Saturday morning brought Jake and Emma to the station with the reluctant enthusiasm of teenagers who'd been promised adventure but expected disappointment. Jake carried a backpack full of snacks and bottled water, while Emma brought earbuds and the skeptical expression she'd perfected during her father's recent struggles with employment and optimism. "So this is the famous inheritance," Emma said, standing on the platform and surveying the clean station with the critical eye of someone determined not to be impressed. "It's smaller than I expected, but cooler," Jake added, already exploring the ticket office with the curiosity that made him his father's favorite companion. "Dad, are those real train tracks?" "Real as anything gets, buddy. They ran from Portland to Spokane before the highways put them out of business." Emma softened slightly at her father's tone, the patient enthusiasm he reserved for sharing things he cared about. "What are you planning to do with it?" It was a fair question that deserved an honest answer, but honesty meant explaining mysteries that he barely understood himself. "I'm trying to figure out what Great-Uncle Harold saw in this place. He spent 50 years taking care of it, paying taxes, maintaining access roads. There has to be a reason. Maybe he just liked trains," Jake suggested, but his father could see the boy's mind working through possibilities that extended beyond simple nostalgia. They spent the morning cleaning windows and sweeping the platform, while Eli told them edited versions of the stories Mrs. Chen had shared, trains that arrived at unusual hours, passengers who weren't recorded in normal manifests, local folklore about mysterious cargo and government operations. He kept the specifics vague, but Jake's eyes lit up with the kind of excitement that came from sensing real adventure beneath adult caution. "Dad," Jake said during their lunch break, "if there really was a mystery train, where do you think it went?" Eli looked toward the tunnel of vegetation that concealed the tracks leading toward Canyon Ridge. "I'm not sure, buddy, but I think maybe it's time we found out." Emma put down her sandwich and studied her father with the intensity she usually reserved for algebra homework. "This isn't just about cleaning up an old building, is it?" "No," he admitted. "I think Great-Uncle Harold left us more than just property. I think he left us a responsibility." "What kind of responsibility?" Before he could answer, the sound of approaching vehicles made them all look toward the access road. 2 black SUVs were navigating the rough track toward the station, moving with the deliberate progress of people who knew exactly where they were going. The vehicles stopped in the clearing beside Eli's truck, and 4 men in expensive suits emerged with the coordinated efficiency of a team that had worked together before. Marcus Vale stepped out of the lead SUV, but the other 3 men stayed near their vehicles in positions that suggested security training and concealed weapons. The message was clear. This wasn't a social visit. "Mr. Mercer," Vale called across the platform, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate attention. "I think it's time we had that conversation about your property's future." Eli stood up slowly, positioning himself between Vale and his children. "This is private property. You're trespassing. Actually, I'm here as a representative of parties with legitimate interests in this location. Parties who have been very patient while you've conducted your amateur historical research." Vale's smile was professionally warm and personally cold. "But patience has limits, especially when it comes to matters of national security." The phrase sent ice through Eli's veins. National security meant government involvement, classified operations, the kind of bureaucratic machinery that could make individuals disappear into legal complications that lasted for years. "Dad?" Jake's voice was small, confused by the sudden tension between the adults. "It's okay, buddy. These gentlemen were just leaving." Vale shook his head. "I'm afraid not. We need to discuss the transfer of this property to parties who understand its historical significance. And we need to discuss the documents you've been collecting. Documents that belong to the federal government and should never have remained in civilian hands." The photograph. Somehow, Vale knew about the photograph and probably about the government envelope hidden in the station master's desk, which meant Eli's investigation was being monitored by people with resources he couldn't begin to match. But looking at Jake's wide eyes and Emma's protective stance beside her younger brother, he realized that some battles couldn't be avoided, no matter how dangerous they might be. Great-Uncle Harold had spent 50 years protecting secrets that were now his responsibility, and those secrets had just become his children's inheritance, whether they understood it or not. "The property isn't for sale," he said quietly. Not ever." Vale's professional mask slipped just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. "That's unfortunate, Mr. Mercer, for all of you." The hand-drawn map revealed itself 3 hours after Vale's departure, when Jake's natural curiosity led him to examine the station master's desk more thoroughly than any adult would have considered appropriate. While Emma helped her father secure the windows and lock the doors with new urgency, Jake had been methodically checking every drawer, every cubbyhole, every space where something important might be hidden. "Dad, there's something weird about this drawer," Jake called from the office, his voice carrying the excitement of genuine discovery. "It's got a false bottom, and there's stuff underneath." Eli joined his son at the desk, noting how the boy's smaller fingers could reach spaces that adult hands couldn't navigate. Together, they worked the hidden panel free, revealing a compartment that contained a rolled sheet of heavy paper, protected by oilcloth and tied with string that had somehow survived 5 decades in better condition than anyone had a right to expect. The map was a work of art disguised as a technical document. Drawn in pencil and ink with the precision of a master draftsman, it showed the Cascade Falls station and its surrounding territory in detail that no official survey had ever attempted. Every building, every trail, every geographical feature had been recorded with the obsessive accuracy of someone who understood that lives might depend on the information's reliability. But it was the map's underground features that made Eli's breath catch in his throat. Beneath the familiar surface landmarks, the artist had drawn a complex network of tunnels, chambers, and passages that turned the Canyon Ridge area into something resembling a Swiss cheese of hidden spaces. The railroad tunnel was there, clearly marked, but it was only one element in a system that included natural caves, abandoned mine shafts, and what appeared to be artificially excavated storage areas. Most intriguingly, the map showed a series of passages that connected the main railroad tunnel to a large chamber located directly beneath mile. Marker 847. The chamber was marked with symbols that suggested it had been modified for storage, with notations about ventilation, drainage, and structural reinforcements that implied someone had spent considerable effort making it suitable for long-term concealment. "Jake, this is incredible work. How did you know to look there?" "Great-Uncle Harold taught me, kind of. Remember those Christmas visits when I was little? He used to show me how furniture was built, how craftsmen hid things in plain sight. He said the most important things were always kept where people wouldn't think to look." Emma joined them at the desk, studying the map with the analytical intensity she usually reserved for science projects. "These passages looked like they were planned. Not natural. Someone spent serious time and money creating this system." The map included a legend that explained the symbols and provided additional information that transformed speculation into actionable intelligence. The large chamber beneath mile marker 847 was labeled Primary Storage, Capacity 200 plus crates. Environmental controls operational, security measures in place. Other chambers were designated for different purposes: document archive, personnel quarters, temporary, equipment storage, and ominously, emergency evacuation route. But the most significant notation was written in different ink, added later in Great-Uncle Harold's careful handwriting. Verified March 1953, contents secured, access maintained, awaiting resolution. "Dad," Emma said quietly, "this looks like someone built an underground city, more like an underground warehouse, someplace to hide things that were too valuable or too dangerous to store in normal facilities. Jake traced the tunnels with his finger, following their routes from the railroad to the various storage chambers. How do we get inside? It was exactly the question Eli had been avoiding, the decision that would transform them from curious inheritors into active treasure hunters with all the risks that implied. But Vale's threat had changed the equation. If powerful people were willing to use intimidation and surveillance to claim the property, then the contents were valuable enough to justify the kind of desperate measures that put families in danger. "We don't do anything hasty," he said finally. "First, we learn everything we can about what we're dealing with." They spent the rest of the afternoon studying the map and planning an exploration that balanced thoroughness with safety. The tunnel system was complex, but Harold's notations suggested that the primary access point was through a concealed entrance near mile marker 847. The map showed a path from the marker to a stone formation that hid the entrance to the main tunnel network. As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, they packed their gear and locked the station with the new understanding that they were no longer just cleaning up a family inheritance. They were preparing to uncover secrets that had been hidden since before Jake and Emma were born, secrets that might be worth millions of dollars or might get them killed, depending on who else was watching their progress. The drive home took them past the turnoff to Canyon Ridge Road, where Eli now knew the eastern entrance to the tunnel system waited behind its concrete barrier. Tomorrow he would return alone to scout the approach and determine whether the sealed tunnel could be safely accessed. But tonight he needed to prepare his children for discoveries that might change their lives in ways none of them could predict. "Dad," Emma said, as they reached the outskirts of Portland, "are we in danger?" It was a fair question that deserved an honest answer, but honesty meant acknowledging fears that he was still trying to process himself. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I think we need to be very careful about who we trust and what we say to other people about what we've found." "What? About Mom?" The question hit him harder than he'd expected. Sarah's involvement with Vale suggested that the investigation had already expanded beyond his control, but keeping secrets from her meant accepting responsibility for whatever consequences might follow. "Let's see what we find tomorrow before we decide who needs to know what." But even as he said the words, Eli knew that the time for cautious investigation was ending. Vale's visit had been a warning disguised as a negotiation, and the next contact would likely be considerably less polite. If the family was going to benefit from Harold's legacy, they needed to act quickly and decisively. The map was secure in his jacket pocket, its details already memorized, with the kind of focused attention he'd once applied to quality control specifications and manufacturing tolerances. Tomorrow, he would follow its guidance into tunnels that had been sealed for 50 years, looking for treasures that belonged to museums and families around the world. But tonight, he was just a father, trying to protect his children from consequences. He didn't fully understand, guided by the patient example of a great-uncle who'd spent 50 years keeping dangerous secrets safe from people who would have used them for the wrong reasons. The conductor's key was warm in his hand as he unlocked his front door, ready for mechanisms it had been designed to operate. Somewhere beneath Canyon Ridge, Special Transport 847's cargo waited for the family member who'd finally found the courage and the tools to claim it. The only question was whether they would be strong enough to handle what they were about to discover. The sealed train car waited in cathedral silence, preserved in the mountain's heart like a prayer that had been whispered 70 years ago and was finally ready to be answered. Eli and Jake stood at the entrance to the hidden chamber, their flashlight beams revealing something that transformed every assumption they'd made about Great-Uncle Harold's inheritance. The chamber was vast, carved from living rock with precision that suggested military engineering rather than civilian construction. But it wasn't empty storage space waiting to be filled. It was a museum of stolen history, organized with the methodical care of someone who'd understood that preservation mattered more than possession. Special Transport 847 sat on rails that had been extended into the mountain, its 3 cars positioned as if the train had simply rolled into the chamber and stopped to wait for passengers who would never board. But the locomotive was gone. Only the 2 passenger cars and the heavily reinforced freight car that had carried the cargo worth killing for. Jake whistled low, the sound echoing through the chamber like the ghost of steam whistles that had once announced arrivals and departures in a world that no longer existed. "Dad, it's like an underground train museum." But it was more than that, Eli realized as they approached the freight car. Harold hadn't just hidden Special Transport 847's cargo. He'd created a sanctuary for treasures that belonged to the world, maintaining them in conditions that would have impressed any museum curator. The freight car's doors stood open, revealing an interior that had been transformed into climate-controlled storage space. Wooden crates lined the walls, each one labeled with inventory numbers, descriptions, and provenance information that told stories of systematic theft and patient recovery. But these weren't the random accumulations of wartime looting. They were organized collections that someone had spent decades cataloging, preserving, and protecting. Eli opened the first crate with hands that trembled despite his efforts at control. Inside, nestled in custom-fitted padding, lay a medieval illuminated manuscript whose gold leaf still gleamed in their flashlight beams. The accompanying documentation, preserved in acid-free folders, identified it as the Echternach Gospels, stolen from Luxembourg's National Library in 1943, and presumed lost until the OSS recovered it from a Nazi collector's Bavarian estate in 1945. The second crate contained jewelry that sparkled with the accumulated sorrow of persecution and loss. Wedding rings, family heirlooms, religious artifacts that had been torn from their owners during deportations to concentration camps. Each piece was accompanied by documentation that recorded its recovery from Nazi hordes, its estimated value, and whenever possible, the name of the family from whom it had been stolen. But it was the third crate that made Eli sit down heavily on the freight car's floor, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Harold had preserved. Gold bars stamped with Swiss banking symbols lay stacked like ingots in a fairy tale, but the accompanying documents told a story that was anything but fantastical. These were bearer bonds, negotiable securities, and financial instruments that represented the stolen wealth of entire nations. Millions of dollars in assets that had been recovered from Nazi accounts and were intended for restitution to the countries and families from whom they'd been taken. "Dad, there are dozens more crates," Jake called from deeper in the freight car, "and they're all labeled like this one." The boy was right. Every crate bore Harold's meticulous documentation, contents, provenance, estimated value, and intended destination. Some were marked for the Smithsonian Institution, others for European museums that had lost treasures to Nazi looting. Many carried the notation "Family Restitution Pending," with lists of surnames and last known addresses that represented Harold's attempts to trace stolen property back to its rightful owners. But the most revealing documents were Harold's personal notes, written in the careful script Eli had come to recognize from the map and other hidden materials. They told the story of a young railroad worker who'd witnessed the arrival of Special Transport 847, who'd understood that something had gone wrong with the official recovery operation, and who'd made the decision to become the cargo's unofficial guardian until proper restitution could be arranged. March 18, 1953. One entry read, "Train crew departed on foot after locomotive suffered mechanical failure in tunnel. Passengers and guards followed, leaving cargo under my temporary custody. Contacted federal authorities. No response. Telegraph. Lines damaged by storm. Decided to secure materials until proper authorities can be contacted." April 15, 1953. Still no response from federal contacts. Local sheriff suggests materials may be evidence in ongoing criminal investigation. Decided to maintain security pending resolution of legal questions. December 1953. Congressional hearings on Operation Safe Haven suspended indefinitely. Newspaper reports suggest political complications regarding recovered assets, beginning to suspect cargo may be safer in current location than in government custody. The entries continued through decades, chronicling Harold's evolving understanding that he'd become the custodian of treasures that powerful interests wanted to forget. He'd used his railroad contacts to research the cargo's origins, his modest income to maintain the chamber's environmental controls, and his growing expertise in art and antiquities to preserve materials that represented the cultural heritage of nations. But the final entries revealed the true scope of Harold's commitment to his unexpected role as guardian of stolen history. January 2020. Health declining. Time to transfer responsibility to family member who will understand importance of proper restitution. Eli has mechanical aptitude and moral character necessary for this work. Station deed and related materials prepared for inheritance. Pray. He will have wisdom to finish what I could not complete. Jake had been exploring the passenger cars while his father read Harold's documentation. Now he returned with discoveries that added another dimension to their understanding of the underground. Sanctuary. Dad, one of the passenger cars has been set up like an office. There are filing cabinets, research materials, correspondence with museums and government agencies. Looks like Great-Uncle Harold spent years trying to figure out how to return all this stuff to the right people. The office car was a revelation that transformed Harold from mysterious recluse into dedicated researcher and advocate for historical justice. File cabinets contained copies of correspondence with institutions around the world, legal research into restitution procedures, genealogical investigations aimed at tracing stolen property to surviving family members. But the most impressive feature was a wall-mounted display that showed photographs and documentation for every major piece in the collection. Harold had created a comprehensive inventory that would have impressed any museum director. Provenance, research, condition reports, authentication documents, and most importantly, evidence of the systematic theft that had brought these treasures into Nazi hands. He wasn't just hiding this stuff, Jake said, studying the display with the intensity he usually reserved for baseball statistics. He was building a case for returning it to the right people. Eli nodded, finally understanding the magnitude of Harold's legacy. His great-uncle hadn't been a treasure hoarder or even a reluctant guardian. He'd been a one-man restitution operation, working in secret to research and document stolen cultural property that official agencies had been unable or unwilling to return to its rightful owners. The financial value was staggering. Gold, jewelry, and negotiable securities worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the cultural value was immeasurable. Medieval manuscripts, Renaissance paintings, religious artifacts, family heirlooms, the accumulated heritage of European civilization preserved in a mountain chamber by a railroad worker who'd understood that some responsibilities couldn't be abandoned. But as they explored deeper into the collection, Jake made a discovery that changed everything. In the back of the freight car, behind crates of documented treasures, sat a smaller section that contained materials marked with red warning tags and Harold's notation: contents unverified, potentially dangerous. Handle with extreme caution. These crates contained documents rather than physical treasures, file folders, photograph albums, and record books that bore Nazi insignias and SS identification numbers. Harold's notes suggested that these were administrative records from the looting operations, documentation of theft, transportation, and storage that could potentially be used to trace other stolen materials or to prosecute war criminals who'd escaped justice. But they also contained something that made Eli's blood run cold: personnel files on American officials who'd been involved in Operation Safe Haven. including evidence that some recovery operations had been compromised by individuals who diverted assets for personal gain rather than returning them to rightful owners. Jake, we need to be very careful with this material. Some of these documents could be dangerous to people who are still alive. The boy nodded seriously, understanding that they'd moved beyond treasure hunting into territory where the wrong discoveries could get them killed. "What do we do now, Dad?" It was the question that had been building since they'd first entered. The chamber, the decision that would determine whether Harold's 50 years of guardianship would end in justice or tragedy. The proper course was clear. Contact the appropriate authorities, arrange for professional authentication and restitution, ensure that the treasures found their way back to museums and families around the world. But the presence of Vale and his associates complicated everything. If powerful interests were willing to use intimidation and surveillance to claim the collection, then involving official agencies might simply transfer the treasures from Harold's careful guardianship to the hands of people who would use them for the wrong purposes. They spent another hour exploring the chamber, documenting the collection with Jake's phone camera and trying to process the implications of Harold's legacy. By the time they emerged from the tunnel system, the sun was setting behind the canyon walls, painting the station in shades of gold that seemed somehow appropriate for their discoveries. But as they approached Eli's truck, they realized they weren't alone. 3 black SUVs were parked in the station clearing, and Marcus Vale stood on the platform with the patient expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Gentlemen," he called as they reached the truck, "I think it's time. We discussed the future of this property and its contents in more detail." The original Operation Nightfall orders arrived at Dr. Patricia Hendricks's office on Monday morning, delivered by a courier who'd driven through the night from Portland, with documents that would either save Eli's family or destroy them. The manila envelope bore the seal of the National Security Archive and contained copies of military documents that had been declassified just 72 hours earlier in response to a Freedom of Information Act request that Hendricks had filed 30 years ago and had almost forgotten about. She called Eli from her office at Georgetown University, where she'd spent her retirement years organizing the kind of historical documents that most people found tedious, but that could occasionally change the world. "Mr. Mercer, I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you will either make you very wealthy or very dead, and I'm not entirely certain which outcome would be preferable." The documents she'd received were the missing pieces of Operation Safe Haven's most classified chapter, the recovery and transportation of assets that had been deemed too sensitive for normal restitution procedures. Special Transport 847 hadn't been carrying ordinary looted treasures. It had been moving evidence of American participation in Nazi financial operations. Documents that proved some of the war's most prominent heroes had been complicit in the very crimes they'd ostensibly fought to prevent. The cargo your great-uncle preserved includes proof that Operation Safe Haven was used as cover for systematic theft by American officials. Hendricks explained, gold that should have been returned to Holocaust survivors was diverted to Swiss. Accounts controlled by OSS operatives. Artwork that should have gone to museums was sold to private collectors. Financial instruments worth millions were simply disappeared from official records. The implications were staggering. Harold hadn't just been guarding stolen Nazi treasure. He'd been protecting evidence of American war crimes, documentation that could destroy reputations, end political careers, and potentially trigger international lawsuits that would cost the federal government billions of dollars in reparations. Dr. Hendricks, are you saying the government has been looking for this material for 70 years? I'm saying that certain individuals within the government have been very motivated to ensure that this material stayed lost. Marcus Vale doesn't represent legitimate federal interests, Mr. Mercer. He represents people who have personal and professional reasons for keeping Operation Safe Haven's failures buried forever. After the call, Eli sat in his kitchen and tried to process the magnitude of Harold's burden. His great-uncle hadn't spent 50 years guarding treasure. He'd been protecting evidence that could bring down some of America's most venerated institutions and individuals. No wonder Vale was willing to use intimidation and surveillance to claim the collection. But the military orders Dr. Hendricks had received also provided something that changed the entire equation: legal documentation that proved Harold's authority to maintain custody of the materials pending resolution of ownership disputes and completion of criminal investigations. The orders, signed by General Omar Bradley himself, designated Harold as temporary custodian with full legal authority to preserve the cargo until proper restitution could be arranged, which meant that legally Harold's inheritance to Eli was legitimate. The family had rightful claim, not just to the property, but to the collection itself and the responsibility for ensuring its proper disposition. But legal authority meant nothing if Vale's associates were willing to use illegal methods to claim the materials. Eli called Sheriff Tom Bradley, no relation to the general, despite the shared surname, and arranged to meet at the station Tuesday morning for what he described as a security consultation regarding valuable historical materials. Bradley was old enough to remember the folklore about Special Transport 847, professional enough to take seriously any situation that involved federal agencies and potential criminal activity. But first, Eli needed to have a conversation with his children that he'd been avoiding since Saturday's discoveries. Emma and Jake deserved to understand the magnitude of what they'd inherited and the dangers that came with Harold's legacy. They met at Martha's Diner on Monday evening, where the familiar comfort of meatloaf and mashed potatoes provided a mundane backdrop for a conversation about Nazi gold and government conspiracies that would have sounded insane in any other context. "So we're not just rich," Emma said, after he'd explained the situation with the careful precision he usually reserved for complex technical problems. "We're dangerous to people who have been covering up war crimes for 70 years. That's about the size of it, sweetheart." Jake pushed peas around his plate with the distracted intensity of someone processing information that was too large for comfortable comprehension. What would Great-Uncle Harold want us to do? It was exactly the right question, asked with the kind of moral clarity that made Eli proud of both his children, despite the impossible situation they faced. Harold's documentation had been clear about his intentions. The collection should be returned to its rightful owners through proper legal channels, with careful attention to historical justice and family restitution. But accomplishing Harold's goals would require surviving Vale's interference and the attention of people who had killed to protect their secrets in the past, and wouldn't hesitate to do so again. "I think Harold would want us to be smart, careful, and committed to doing the right thing even when it's dangerous." Emma nodded with the serious expression she wore when working through difficult mathematical proofs. "So we need to make sure the right people know about the collection before Vale can do anything to stop us." "Exactly. Dr. Hendricks is contacting museums, government agencies, and international organizations that specialize in restitution. Sheriff Bradley will provide security while we document everything properly. And we need to make sure that if something happens to us, the truth about Harold's collection gets told anyway." They spent the next hour planning a campaign that balanced idealism with practical security concerns. Emma would research online resources for Holocaust restitution and family genealogy, using her considerable internet skills to trace stolen and property back to surviving relatives. Jake would help document the collection with systematic photography and inventory management, applying the organizational skills he'd learned from baseball card collecting to treasures worth millions of dollars. And Eli would coordinate with Dr. Hendricks, Sheriff Bradley, and the growing network of legal and historical experts who were beginning to understand that Harold's collection represented one of the most significant cultural discoveries since the opening of King Tut's tomb. But they all understood that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Vale's patience had limits, and the people he represented had resources that extended far beyond normal business negotiations. The family needed to move quickly, decisively, and with the kind of coordinated precision that would have impressed Harold's wartime contemporaries. Tuesday morning brought Sheriff Bradley to the station with a deputy and a healthy skepticism that evaporated the moment he saw Harold's underground museum. The law enforcement officers spent 2 hours exploring the collection, documenting its contents, and trying to process the implications of discovering hundreds of millions of dollars in stolen cultural property hidden beneath their jurisdiction. "Mr. Mercer," Bradley said finally, "this is considerably more complicated than anything I've dealt with in 30 years of police work. But it's also clearly a matter of legitimate historical importance that deserves professional handling." The sheriff's support provided the official legitimacy they needed to contact federal agencies without triggering the kind of bureaucratic complications that could tie up the collection for decades. But it also meant that knowledge of the discovery was spreading beyond their ability to control, increasing the risk that Vale's associates would escalate their interference before proper documentation could be completed. Dr. Hendricks arrived Tuesday afternoon with a team of graduate students and archival specialists who treated Harold's collection with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. They worked with methodical efficiency, photographing every item, cross-referencing provenance documentation, and building a comprehensive database that would support restitution claims around the world. But the most significant discovery came from the Nazi administrative records that Harold had marked as potentially dangerous. Hidden among personnel files and transportation documents, Dr. Hendricks found evidence that Operation Safe Haven had been compromised from the beginning by American officials who'd used recovery operations to build personal fortunes from stolen assets. These documents prove that Senator William Hartwell, the man who ran for president in 1960 on a platform of moral leadership and international justice, personally diverted millions of dollars in recovered Nazi gold to Swiss accounts. Under his control, she explained to Eli and Sheriff Bradley. His son currently serves on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and his grandson is a federal appeals court judge. The implications were explosive. The Hartwell family represented 3 generations of American political leadership, their reputations built on the foundation of stolen Holocaust wealth. Revealing Harold's evidence would destroy careers, trigger criminal investigations, and potentially reshape public understanding of America's role in post-war recovery operations. But it would also put Eli's family in the crosshairs of people who had spent 70 years ensuring that particular truth stayed buried. Wednesday morning brought the confrontation that everyone had been expecting but hoping to avoid. Vale arrived at the station with a larger security team and federal marshals, carrying what appeared to be legitimate seizure orders for materials relevant to ongoing national security investigations. But Sheriff Bradley had anticipated the move, coordinating with Dr. Hendricks and the National Security Archive to ensure that copies of all critical documents were already secured in multiple locations beyond Vale's reach. The original operation. Nightfall orders had been filed with federal courts in 3 jurisdictions, making it legally impossible for any single agency to suppress the evidence through bureaucratic maneuvering. "Mr. Vale," Sheriff Bradley said with the patient authority of someone who'd been dealing with federal overreach longer than most people had been alive, "these seizure orders don't supersede Mr. Mercer's legitimate ownership of this property, or his legal authority as designated custodian of these materials. Sheriff, you're interfering with a matter of national security." "No, sir. I'm enforcing local law regarding private property and historical preservation. If you have legitimate federal authority here, you'll need to coordinate with proper judicial oversight, not show up with guns and attitude." The standoff lasted 3 hours, with lawyers arriving by helicopter and federal officials making phone calls to Washington while Eli's family waited in the station master's office, surrounded by documentation that could change the course of American history or get them killed, depending on how the next few hours developed. But the resolution, when it came, was anticlimactic in the way that most bureaucratic victories tend to be. A federal judge in Portland issued a temporary restraining order that prevented seizure of the materials pending full judicial review, and a Justice Department attorney arrived with instructions to treat the discovery as a matter for international restitution rather than domestic security. Vail left with his team and his threats, but everyone understood that the immediate crisis had been resolved rather than ended. The people he represented would find other ways to suppress Harold's evidence, using methods that didn't require legal authority or public accountability. That evening, as Eli and his children sat on the station platform watching the sun set behind Canyon Ridge, they all understood that their lives had changed in ways that couldn't be reversed. Harold's inheritance had made them wealthy beyond their previous imagination, but it had also made them guardians of secrets that powerful people would kill to protect. "Dad," Jake said, throwing stones at an imaginary target in the gathering darkness, "are we going to be okay?" It was the question that had been haunting Eli since Saturday's discoveries, the fear that had kept him awake despite his exhaustion from the day's events. But looking at his children, Emma with her fierce intelligence and Jake with his unshakable moral compass, he realized that Harold had chosen his successor well. "We're going to be fine, buddy. We're going to do what Great Uncle Harold would have wanted. Make sure these treasures get back to the people they belong to, and make sure the truth about what happened gets told properly, even if it's dangerous. Especially if it's dangerous, some things are worth the risk." The statement would be tested sooner than any of them expected. Great Uncle Harold's personal journal waited in the conductor's compartment of the sealed train car, hidden in a space so obvious that 50 years of searchers had overlooked it completely. Emma found it Thursday morning while photographing the passenger cars for Dr. Hendrix's documentation project, tucked behind the engineer's seat in a leather satchel that had somehow survived decades of mountain humidity without significant deterioration. The journal's contents transformed Harold from patient guardian into active participant in one of the Cold War's most complex moral dramas. His entries revealed that he hadn't just happened to be working at the station when Special Transport 847 arrived. He'd been recruited by OSS operatives who needed a reliable contact in civilian infrastructure for operations that couldn't be conducted through normal military channels. February 15th, 1953, the first relevant entry read, "Contacted by federal agents regarding special transportation requirements. Agreed to provide assistance for recovery operations involving war crimes evidence. Told operation has presidential authorization and will contribute to international justice efforts." But subsequent entries revealed Harold's growing understanding that Operation Safe Haven had been compromised by officials who were using recovery operations to enrich themselves rather than return stolen assets to rightful owners. March 10th, 1953. Received detailed manifest for Special Transport 847. Contents include not just recovered Nazi assets, but documentation of American participation in theft and concealment. Agent Morrison admits some recovered materials have been diverted for national security purposes. Suspect this means personal enrichment by operation commanders. The journal chronicled Harold's transformation from naive patriot to reluctant whistleblower, as he realized that the very people who'd recruited him were committing the same crimes they claimed to be investigating. March 17th, 1953. Train arrived as scheduled, but crew reported that they'd been followed by unmarked vehicles since leaving Denver. Engineer believes operation has been compromised. Made decision to conceal cargo until proper authorities can be contacted. Train departed with empty cars. Crew instructed to report mechanical failure if questioned. But the journal's most explosive revelation was Harold's documentation of subsequent events: attempts by federal agents to recover the hidden cargo, threats against his family, and eventually a direct order to forget everything he'd witnessed, or face charges for interfering with national security operations. April 30th, 1953. Agent Morrison visited again, this time with different message: told to maintain silence about Operation Nightfall or face criminal prosecution for theft of government property. Made clear that cooperation with future investigations would result in unfortunate accidents for family members. Harold's response had been characteristically methodical. Instead of surrendering the cargo or succumbing to threats, he'd begun documenting everything, photographing the collection, researching the stolen items' origins, and building the comprehensive restitution database that had occupied the rest of his life. But the journal also revealed that Harold hadn't worked alone. Over the years, he'd developed contacts with European museums, Holocaust survivor organizations, and international law enforcement agencies that specialized in recovering stolen cultural property. His seemingly isolated vigil had actually been part of a patient campaign to ensure that Special Transport 847's cargo would eventually find its way back to rightful owners. December 1995, contact established with Dr. Patricia Hendricks at National Security Archive. She understands importance of proper documentation and has resources to ensure eventual restitution. Beginning to believe that resolution is possible. Within my lifetime. January 2010, health declining but work nearly complete. All major items documented, most families traced, legal framework established for restitution. Time to identify successor who can complete what I began. Emma read portions of the journal aloud to her father and brother as they sat in the train car that had become Harold's secret office, surrounded by decades of meticulous research and patient preparation. The scope of their great-uncle's commitment was staggering. 50 years of unpaid labor to ensure that justice would eventually triumph over greed and institutional corruption. But the journal also contained practical information that changed their understanding of the current crisis. Harold had anticipated that powerful interests would eventually attempt to reclaim the cargo, and he'd taken steps to ensure that the truth would survive even if something happened to him or his successors. Safety deposit boxes established in Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, containing copies of all critical documentation. Instructions for accessing boxes included in inheritance materials. If anything happens to station or cargo, evidence will still be available for proper authorities. The safety deposit boxes were Harold's insurance policy, his guarantee that decades of work wouldn't be lost to bureaucratic manipulation or criminal interference. But accessing them would require the keys that Harold had hidden in the station, and using the evidence would require courage that Eli wasn't certain he possessed. Thursday afternoon brought news that transformed careful planning into urgent necessity. Dr. Hendricks called from Washington with information that Vail and his associates were preparing legal challenges that could tie up the collection for years while they developed alternative approaches to claiming it. They're filing suit in federal court, claiming that the materials are evidence in ongoing criminal investigations and therefore subject to government seizure pending resolution of national security concerns, she explained. It's a stalling tactic, designed to give them time to develop more direct methods of recovering the cargo. But she also had news that provided hope for a different resolution. International law enforcement agencies were preparing their own legal actions based on Harold's documentation, seeking restitution for stolen cultural property under treaties that superseded domestic American law. The Swiss government is particularly interested in recovering financial instruments that were stolen from their banks. The German government wants the artwork that was looted from their museums, and the Israeli government is demanding access to materials that can help trace assets stolen from Holocaust victims. The international pressure was building exactly as Harold had planned, creating a legal and diplomatic crisis that would be impossible for Vale's associates to suppress through normal bureaucratic channels. But it also meant that Eli's family was caught in the middle of conflicts that extended far beyond their ability to control or comprehend. Dr. Hendricks, what do you think Harold would want us to do? I think he'd want you to be brave, Mr. Mercer. And I think he'd want you to trust the systems he spent 50 years building to ensure that justice would eventually prevail. That evening, as Eli sat in the station master's office reading Harold's journal by lamplight, he began to understand the true scope of his inheritance. Harold hadn't just left him property and treasure. He'd left him a mission that was nearly complete, a life work that needed only courage and determination to reach its intended conclusion. The legal hearing was scheduled for Friday morning in Tulmus Federal Court in Portland. Eli would need to appear as Harold's designated successor, presenting documentation that proved his authority to maintain custody of the collection pending international restitution efforts. Dr. Hendricks would provide expert testimony about the material's historical significance, while representatives from European governments would argue for their nation's claims to specific items. But most importantly, Harold's journal would be entered as evidence, revealing for the first time the full scope of Operation Safe Haven's corruption and the systematic theft that had been concealed for 70 years. The Hartwell family's crimes would be exposed, along with the names of dozens of other officials who'd used recovery operations to enrich themselves at the expense of Holocaust survivors and war victims. It would be the kind of revelation that destroyed political careers, triggered criminal investigations, and forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about its heroes' behavior during the nation's supposed moral triumph over fascism. But it would also ensure that Harold's decades of patient work would finally achieve their intended purpose. The question was whether Eli had inherited enough of Harold's courage to see the mission through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal cost to his family. The international treaty documents arrived at the federal courthouse in Portland at exactly 9 a.m. Friday morning, delivered by diplomatic couriers from 5 different nations who had coordinated their timing with the precision of a military operation. Eli sat in the gallery with Jake and Emma, watching as history prepared to render its judgment on Harold's 50 years of patient guardianship. Judge Margaret Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen from Cascade Falls, despite the shared surname, presided over proceedings that would determine whether justice could triumph over institutional corruption, or whether powerful interests would succeed in burying evidence that could reshape public understanding of America's role in post-war recovery operations. The courtroom was crowded with representatives from European governments, Holocaust survivor organizations, museum directors, and media representatives who sensed that they were witnessing something historically significant. But it was the presence of 3 elderly men in expensive suits, sitting in the front row with the patient expressions of people accustomed to getting their way, that made Eli's stomach clench with recognition. The Hartwell family had come to defend their legacy. Dr. Hendricks took the stand first, presenting Harold's documentation with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades preparing for this moment. She explained the significance of Operation Safe Haven, the systematic theft that had characterized Nazi occupation, and the complex moral questions that arose when recovered assets were diverted by the very officials charged with returning them to rightful owners. Your Honor, the documents preserved by Mr. Harold Mercer represent one of the most comprehensive records of post-war recovery operations ever assembled. They prove that substantial portions of recovered Nazi assets were diverted for personal enrichment by American officials, rather than being returned to the victims of theft as international law required. The treaty documents she presented were even more damaging to Vale's position than Eli had expected. 5 European nations had filed formal restitution claims under international agreements that superseded domestic American law, demanding the return of cultural property that had been stolen from their museums and citizens during the war. But it was the Swiss banking documents that proved most explosive. They contained account numbers, transaction records, and documentation of financial transfers that proved American officials had used Swiss banks to launder stolen Nazi assets, converting them into personal wealth that had been hidden for 70 years. Senator William Hartwell's grandson took the stand in his family's defense, arguing that classified operations from 70 years ago couldn't be evaluated using contemporary moral standards, and that revealing details of Operation Safe Haven would damage national security and harm America's relationships with European allies. Your Honor, these documents represent classified intelligence materials that were never intended for public disclosure. Releasing them would compromise ongoing investigations and potentially endanger current operations that depend on confidentiality. But Judge Chen had clearly done her homework on international law and the specific treaties governing cultural property recovery. Her questions revealed that she understood the broader implications of the case and wasn't willing to allow bureaucratic arguments to override legitimate restitution claims. Mr. Hartwell, are you arguing that American officials have the right to conceal evidence of war crimes indefinitely, simply because that evidence might prove embarrassing to their families or institutions? The turning point came when Emma took the stand as Harold's great-great-niece and designated successor. At 16, she possessed a moral clarity that cut through legal complexity with devastating effectiveness. Your Honor, my great-uncle spent 50 years trying to return stolen property to the people it belonged to. He wasn't hoarding treasure or trying to get rich. He was trying to do the right thing when the government wouldn't. These families deserve to have their property back, and the world deserves to know the truth about what happened. Her testimony was brief, but it crystallized the moral questions at the heart of the case in ways that hours of legal arguments couldn't match. The courtroom was silent when she finished, and even the Hartwell representatives looked uncomfortable with their position. Judge Chen's ruling came after a 30-minute recess that felt like hours. She emerged from chambers with the kind of expression that suggested she understood she was making decisions that would be studied by legal scholars for generations. The court finds that Mr. Eli Mercer, as designated successor to Mr. Harold James Mercer, has legitimate authority to maintain custody of materials recovered under Operation Safe Haven, pending international restitution efforts. The court further finds that international treaties governing cultural property recovery supersede domestic claims of national security privilege when those claims are used to conceal evidence of criminal activity. The ruling was a complete victory for Harold's vision of justice, but it also meant that Eli's family would be responsible for overseeing restitution efforts that would likely take years to complete and would certainly attract the attention of people who had spent decades ensuring that particular truth stayed buried. But Judge Chen's order also provided protection that Harold had never enjoyed. The court appointed independent trustees to oversee the restitution process, established security measures to protect the collection and the family responsible for it, and most importantly, ordered full disclosure of all recovered documents to ensure that the truth about Operation Safe Haven would finally be told. Outside the courthouse, Eli stood with his children, and Dr. Hendricks, as reporters, asked questions about the discovery and its implications for American history. Emma handled the media attention with poise that impressed everyone, while Jake stayed close to his father, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. But it was Martha Kowalski's arrival that provided the most emotional moment of the day. The diner owner had driven down from Cascade Falls with a thermos of coffee and sandwiches, understanding that the family would need familiar comfort food after their extraordinary morning. "Harold would be proud," she said simply, hugging Eli with the fierce affection of someone who'd watched him struggle and was grateful to see him triumph. He always knew you had the strength to finish what he started, the drive back to Cascade. Waltz took them through familiar valleys that looked somehow different now that the mystery of Special Transport 847 had been resolved. They stopped at the station for one final visit to Harold's underground museum, which would soon be transformed into an official repository for recovered cultural property under international supervision. The sealed train car looked smaller now, that its secrets had been revealed, but the collection itself seemed more impressive, surrounded by the protection of legal authority and international support. Harold's patient work would finally achieve its intended purpose, reuniting stolen treasures with their rightful owners and exposing the corruption that had concealed those crimes for 70 years. But as they prepared to leave the station, Jake made one final discovery that added a perfect conclusion to Harold's story. Hidden in the conductor's compartment, beneath the journal they'd found earlier, was a letter addressed to "My successor, whoever you may be." The letter was Harold's final message to the family member who would complete his mission. If you are reading this, then the work is finished and justice has finally prevailed. I am proud of your courage and grateful for your commitment to doing the right thing when it would have been easier to walk away. The treasures you have protected belong to the world, but the satisfaction of seeing them returned to rightful owners belongs to you. Use it wisely and remember that some responsibilities are too important to abandon, no matter how long they take to fulfill. Eli folded the letter carefully and put it in his jacket pocket next to the conductor's keys that had started this journey. Tomorrow, the station would be transformed into something Harold had never dared imagine, a public monument to the power of patient justice and the courage required to confront institutional corruption. But tonight, it was still just the place where a railroad worker had made the decision to do the right thing, regardless of personal cost or bureaucratic pressure. And that, Eli realized, was the true treasure Harold had left his family, not gold or artwork, but the example of moral courage that would guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. The restored station bell rang for the first time in 70 years on a crisp October morning, its bronze voice carrying across Canyon Ridge with the clear authority of something that had waited patiently for the right moment to sing. Eli stood on the platform with Emma and Jake, watching as the first official visitors arrived for the dedication of the Harold James Mercer Center for Cultural Restitution. 6 months had transformed the abandoned train station into something that would have amazed its original builders, a world-class facility for researching stolen cultural property and coordinating international restitution efforts. The underground chamber that had once hidden Special Transport 847's cargo now housed climate-controlled storage for artifacts awaiting return to their rightful owners, while the station building itself contained research facilities, administrative offices, and a public museum that told the story of systematic theft and patient recovery. But the most significant transformation was in Eli himself. The unemployed factory worker who'd inherited what looked like worthless property had become the director of an institution that was already being studied by governments and museums around the world as a model for addressing the complex moral questions raised by wartime theft and institutional corruption. Martha Kowalski arrived early, as she had for every important event in Cascade Falls for the past 40 years, carrying a covered plate and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd always suspected that Harold's Tuesday morning coffee had been about more than nostalgia for departed trains. He would have loved this, she said, setting the plate on the restored ticket counter and looking around the waiting room that now displayed photographs documenting the restitution efforts that had already reunited dozens of families with stolen property. All these years, I thought he was just a lonely old man who missed the railroad days. Turns out he was running the most successful stolen property recovery operation in history. The morning's dedication ceremony brought together an extraordinary collection of people who represented Harold's legacy in all its complexity. Dr. Hendricks had flown in from Washington with a delegation of government archivists and museum directors. Representatives from 5 European nations were present to formally thank the Mercer family for their role in exposing Operation Safe Haven's corruption and facilitating the return of stolen cultural property. But the most moving presence was that of Holocaust survivors and their families who had recovered property that they'd never expected to see again. An elderly woman from Montreal held a photograph of her grandmother wearing jewelry that had been stolen during deportation to Auschwitz and had been recovered from Harold's collection. A man from Berlin examined medieval manuscripts that had been looted from his family's library in 1943 and were now being returned to a German museum in his honor. Emma had grown into her role as the center's youngest board member with the same determination she'd once applied to algebra homework. At 16, she was already corresponding with families around the world, using her internet skills to trace stolen property and coordinate with international agencies that specialized in cultural restitution. Dad, Mrs. Goldstein from New York, wants to know if we found any information about her grandfather's watch collection. She has photographs and insurance documents from before the war. Jake had become the center's unofficial historian, documenting recovery efforts with the same systematic attention he'd once devoted to baseball statistics. His photography now graced museum exhibits and academic publications that studied Harold's methods and their implications for addressing institutional corruption. But it was Sheriff Tom Bradley's presence at the ceremony that provided the most satisfying vindication of their decision to trust local law enforcement with secrets that federal agencies had spent decades concealing. When Eli first told me about finding old railroad documents, I figured we were dealing with routine historical materials, Bradley told the assembled crowd. I never imagined we'd uncover one of the most significant cultural restitution operations in modern history. But that's the thing about doing the right thing. You never know how important your decisions will turn out to be until you look back at them with the wisdom of time. The afternoon brought private tours of the underground facility for visiting dignitaries and researchers who would carry news of Harold's work back to institutions around the world. The sealed train car had been preserved as a monument to patient guardianship, its contents replaced by displays that told the story of systematic theft and methodical recovery. But the most significant moment came when Marcus Vale arrived, unannounced and uninvited, with the kind of defeated expression that suggested his clients had finally accepted that Harold's legacy couldn't be suppressed or controlled. "Mr. Mercer," he said, approaching Eli on the platform where they'd first met under very different circumstances. "I wanted to apologize for the pressure my associates brought to bear on your family. We believed we were protecting national security interests, but we failed to understand the moral complexity of the situation. It was as close to an admission of wrongdoing as Eli expected to receive from someone who'd represented interests that had spent 70 years concealing evidence of crimes." But Vale's presence also confirmed that the legal protections Judge Chen had established were working. The people who'd once been willing to use intimidation and threats now had to respect the judicial authority that protected Harold's work. The sun began to set behind Canyon Ridge, painting the station in the same golden light that had witnessed Harold's decades of solitary vigil. Eli walked the platform with his children and reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The financial rewards had been substantial, finder's fees and consulting contracts that provided security he'd never imagined. But the personal satisfaction of completing Harold's mission was immeasurable. The restored station bell sat in its tower above the waiting room, its bronze surface gleaming with the care that Jake had lavished on its restoration. Harold's inscription was still visible around its rim, in memory of those whose treasures were stolen and whose stories deserved to be told. Emma found her father by the bell tower as the last visitors departed, and the mountain quiet settled over the station. "Dad, do you think we did the right thing? Taking on all this responsibility, I mean." It was exactly the kind of question that Harold would have asked himself during his 50 years of guardianship, the doubt that came from understanding that moral choices often carried consequences that extended far beyond personal comfort or convenience. "I think we did what Harold would have wanted us to do," Eli said finally, "and I think we learned something important about the kind of people we want to be when we're faced with difficult decisions." Jake joined them by the bell, carrying the station's original logbook that had started their investigation 6 months earlier. The boy had developed Harold's patience and attention to detail, but also possessed the kind of optimism that came from seeing justice triumph over corruption through persistent effort and moral courage. Next week, we're getting visitors from the Smithsonian who want to study Harold's documentation methods, Jake announced with the pride of someone who understood that their great-uncle's work was being recognized by the world's most prestigious institutions. And Emma's been invited to speak at a conference about using internet research for family restitution. The evening train from Portland arrived exactly on schedule, carrying visitors who would spend the weekend touring the center and learning about Harold's approach to cultural recovery. The Cascade Falls Railroad Station was once again serving its intended purpose, connecting people across distances and differences, facilitating journeys that mattered. But as Eli pulled the cord that rang the station bell in welcome to arriving passengers, he understood that the most important journey had been the one that brought his family from financial desperation and personal doubt to moral purpose and historical significance. Harold's inheritance had included more than property and treasure. It had provided the opportunity to discover what kind of people they could become when faced with responsibilities too important to abandon. The bell's bronze voice carried across the canyon with patient authority, calling the world's attention to truths that had waited 70 years to be told, and treasures that had finally found their way home. It was the sound of justice acknowledged, of families reunited with stolen property, and of one man's 50-year commitment to doing the right thing finally reaching its intended conclusion. Somewhere in the mountain stillness, Harold's spirit could rest peacefully, knowing that his work would continue in capable hands and that the train station he'd protected had become exactly what he'd always envisioned. A place where history's wrongs could be made right through patience, courage, and unwavering commitment to moral truth. The last light faded behind Canyon Ridge, but the station's windows glowed warm and welcoming, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring to the continuing work of cultural restitution and historical justice. The Harold James Mercer Center for Cultural Restitution would endure as long as there were families searching for stolen property and institutions committed to acknowledging the complex moral legacy of humanity's darkest chapters. And in the morning, the bell would ring again, calling the world's attention to the power of patient justice and the courage required to complete missions that seem impossible until someone has the determination to see them through to their proper conclusion.